Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I just feel like it's the little stuff. It's that stuff, that is uh where we have to change our thinking. Uh, I mean, I think we have to change our thinking in a lot of places, but that one's bothering me. It's bothering me that I feel like you guys are saying, "Well, wasn't that bad?" I feel like you should be incensed by that. I'm incensed by it. So help me with that.
When
Talk me
you're
through it.
when you're I think I'm going to stretch here. When you're outnumbered, you are and I don't want to say forced, but I want to say conditioned to to absorb what's happening around you. I mean, you're going to fight a losing battle if it's you versus, like in my situation, you versus 1,000 kids. And my mom's success got me to maybe a better opportunity of a school, but at the same time, I don't get to raise havoc because I'm in the lunch line and somebody says, "Oh, look, it's a reverse Oreo." If I raise havoc, it's me versus all the other kids who grew up maybe a certain way. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
I'm not now. For me, it is bad, and it's always been bad. But the question is, at what point are we allowed to speak up, right? Because let's say it is bad. I go and I speak up. Guess who I'm going to meet? My white assistant principal. It doesn't stop there. Guess who I'm going to meet? My white principal. It don't stop there. Guess who I'm going to meet? The white superintendent. Now, I'm not saying that every person in that line is racist, but somebody in that line may have grown up a different way, and now it's going to be a fight to get to the real, right? Well, Johnny didn't mean it. He doesn't know what he doesn't know, which reminds me of where we at today. It was just one bad apple in the seed, but yet we keep continuing to be in a book of inequality and racism, and the book ain't closed. Just like we are right now. Ferguson happened, riots happen, all of the same stuff happened. Guess what? Smoothed right over, right back to square one. Nothing changed, right?
Yeah.
So do we want the same mentality of, oh, it wasn't that bad? No, it was that bad. And you're right. It starts with the little stuff. But I guess the better question is, not every person in our situations have the ability to have many of us around them to raise the flag. Schools didn't look 50-50. Depends on where you grew up, right? Same thing on the other end. Let me just the other end. A white person that maybe receive it in an all-black school, Princeton. When do they raise the flag? But we're talking about what we're talking about today, which is this. I couldn't raise the flag as much because I'm the only one of two there. So what am I going to do? Cuddle up with two guys, and then we're going to go all the way down the line to do what? Maybe get a slap on the hand. It's not going to be that serious because it's going to just be, that was just a bad apple. Let's move on. Right? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Anybody else want to throw in on that?
I mean, I feel that as well. Around for me, I really felt it after 9/11. Actually, I would say from when 9/11 happened till maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where you step on a plane. Now, I've never been stopped by TSA or been, had to be wanted because I had, they felt I was suspicious or anything like that. But there was a period when I was with Simple Youth Ministry, and Darren, I would fly out to meet up with you and Danette at whatever conference we were going to. It felt like every plane I went on, somebody was being pulled off. And you do want to stand up for that person. You do want to stand up and say, hey, this guy wasn't saying what he was saying, or he wasn't looking suspicious or something like that. But same thing, when you're looking around the plane and you're outnumbered, you almost can't speak up because of that bad seed, that bad apple. I read an article this morning. I think it was in the LA Times that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote, and his perspective was eye-opening. He says, for a white family to see what's happening on TV right now and to hear about this injustice, and they're like, oh man, that stinks. That's awful. That's horrible. But then there's a black family who's looking at the same thing and they get irate over it. Now, should it result in looting? I don't know. I'm not in that space to say it's right or wrong. But the anger is justified because when you look at your kids and you say, my kid could just be walking to his buddy's house and tensions are high, and for whatever reason they get stopped and they get beaten or they get killed or this, that, and the other. That's why in his article, that's why he said that's the difference between a white home and a black home. Is a white person can go out for a walk and not have to worry about that. A black person may send their kids out or may go to the store themselves, and they're the ones that are going to be potentially on the news. You know what I mean? And reading that, for me, even as an Arab American, that's mind-boggling. That's baffling.
Yeah, I read a story today about a man who said, I never, ever walk in my neighborhood unless I'm walking with my daughter, because then I'm a dad. I'm not just a black man. And I just have so little context for what that even feels like. And I'm heartbroken that anybody even has to think that. We had a conversation in our church. Our pastor had a conversation with several people involving all this so that we can understand better what we can do, which eventually we'll get to that part of this conversation. What can an average person do? And one of the stories came from a lady who works in our church who said she preps her daughter about how to shop at the mall. If you don't touch anything unless you plan to buy it. If you pick something up and you don't buy it, take it to a clerk to put it back so that you're not accused of shoplifting. And I've never told my kids that. A good friend of mine, Sam, talked about how his dad taught him what to do when you get stopped. Like if you get stopped in a car, what do you do? And Sam, as a 16-year-old black kid said, oh, well, I get my wallet, I get my license or whatever, my registration. And his dad was like, yeah, and now you just got shot. You put your hands on the steering wheel, you wait for someone to approach, you do everything they tell you to do. And I'm sitting here thinking, I have 3 kids that I've recently taught to drive. I never taught them that. That was never even in my, it's so far out of my context. And I want to understand that better because I feel like I want to defend you. I want to defend this moment. We shouldn't have to teach our kids that. And I don't know what to do to change that. So that's a big part of the reason I want us to throw these kinds of stories on the table, right? Like watching Arab Americans be pulled off airplanes after 9/11. I was on a plane where somebody came in who was clearly Middle Eastern, and just the whispering and the grossness of that moment was palpable. And I just don't, I want to fix that. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know what to do with it. Sorry, I keep ranting, mainly because I don't know what else to do. Zoran, it's, again, to my, to the differences in how we grow up, right? It has never dawned on me, oh, I couldn't take this up the chain because the people up the chain might not share my experience.
Yeah. I looked, let me start by saying I don't really promote the looting, especially scheduled looting. It's getting to the point where it's being scheduled. Sorry. So that's just not my deal. But what happened in Minneapolis, the looting based off of rage, I don't know. Just gonna
I get it. Yep, I know.
I don't
either.
But scheduled looting, no, I don't get down. Here's the funny thing. Let's say the big thing about this is let's say that when the looting stops, the big thing for me is don't stop talking about it now. Don't make this
Mm-hmm.
enough. Don't just swipe under the table now. Let's focus on the looting now. It's over. No. Life's still gone. So when the looting's over, we get past all this and people start, doing what they got to do. Keep talking about it. I tell all my friends in my community, okay, keep posting about it. Don't let it go. Because questions may get asked to me. All right, well, let's say the looting didn't happen and let's say it was a peaceful protest. Okay, and let's say we protested and that's still happening right now. I tell you when I tell you about going up the chain, you go all the way up the chain. You ever looked at the Supreme Court and what it looks like? Does it look like America to you? You look at a picture of it. It's kind of funny. It's the same thing that we experience right now, which, again, I'm glad that women are up there. Women are up on the Supreme Court. But if you look at the Supreme Court and you take the women out, 5 or 6 white guys, 1 black dude, right? Does he feel outnumbered? And I'm not saying that that's the case, but I'm just saying things look the same all the way up, right? So you get yourself all the way up, they still look the same. And what is it going to take for African Americans to get opportunities, for Arabics to get opportunities, for America to look the way it's supposed to look, right? We think of O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson, back in the day, went to California because it was more diverse. He had a better chance of playing football, right? When is America going to start looking like that all the way up the chain so that it's even and that it doesn't have to be so angry where we have to wait and think about should the police officer be put in jail? We got to think about it for that many days. Well, should he? Or a bunch of police officers, again, I get that they needed to protect him for his life, and that was the wrong way about going about it, but have to protect him that long. It should have been automatic. Boom. This is all over national news. This was wrong. He's got to go now. We'll make our decision. But America doesn't look like that. It starts down here where we're all at, and as you go up, it looks the way that it's always looked for decades and decades and decades, lopsided. And my question is not like, again, I come from a mom that really did her thing. Woman, African-American vice president, all odds against her. She did it. She made it, right? I'm not looking for a pity party, but what sort of opportunities can Afro-Americans and Arabics get to be on high platforms so that when we have conversation and debates, it's healthy and everybody's coming from a different generation, a different background, not the same sort of thing at all times. Sorry, my fists are clenched. My bad. I'm getting low. Let me slow down. But does that make sense? It's the same.
Yeah.
It's, to me, my biggest thing is I'm just looking up the chain. When this is over, when the looting is done, don't stop talking about it. But how is it going to get fixed? And it's going to have to be, and I don't know how to say this, but I don't know where we're going to start, because the top in any company, in any business, any small business, they always say, and you hear it, the top down, right? Whatever the top looks like is what it's going to affect going down in the business. That's what's going to affect your business. If they're on the same page, if they've got the right morals or agreements, they're going to go. Well, look at our top down, Supreme Court. Right? Again, I'm not calling these individuals racist. By no means am I.
I get that. I hear exactly what you're saying, Zoran.
It doesn't look the same as what America looks right now. So.
I agree with Zoran that the conversation has to continue. I think it's very helpful if it can come, if we as minorities can come from a place of emotional intelligence, of intercultural sensitivity, because I've had conversations numerous with my white friends, and on the one hand, some of my white friends are stuttering and stammering and going, I'm sorry. I don't even know what else to say, Danette. I'm sorry. And then there are some who I'm very grateful have knocked on my office a couple of years ago, I think when the Charlotte thing happened. And at the time I was the only person of color on staff, and she just knocked on my door and she just said, "Hey, Danette, I just wanted to check on you and to see how you're doing." And I was so conditioned, going back to Zoran's point about being outnumbered, and not even in a negative way. I love where I work, and I love my crew. I love my colleagues, but so conditioned to internally process these things about race and culture. When she said, I want to see how you're doing, I didn't know what she meant. And she said, I watch the news. Well, then I started crying. And she said, Danette, I don't relate. I just want you to know I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And we had a very precious conversation. Now, a couple of years later, after Ahmaud Arbery's death, different coworker, same thing. And I want to say to my precious white friends, that is powerful. And as a people who say we follow Jesus, I'll just tell you right now, I might sound like an old lady. I make no apology. No looting. I don't care if it's scheduled or not. If it's not on the schedule. When I was a kid, I shoplifted. It wasn't on the schedule, but it was always appealing. But because it propagates the stereotype, and I see, especially in a situation like this, the looting, the violence, the tension is understandable. The anger is absolutely unapologetically understandable, but the crime, whether it's perpetrated by Antifa or within a crowd and spitting at the cops, all that does is propagate the stereotype, and it doesn't help our cause. I think very few people even know who George Floyd's mother's name is, or Ahmaud Arbery's mother's name, and Floyd's sister, because his mother's passed. So you get the point. I feel like the violence and the looting causes us to miss the point and causes the conversation to become completely different.
I do think, from my perspective, for the first time ever, I get it. But it feels to me like when you're trying to teach your kids, you're like, the stove is hot, the stove is hot, the stove is hot, don't touch that stove, the stove is hot, right? And, they just keep going for it, they keep going for it, so finally you have to slap their hand, right? And it feels a little bit like that. Like, listen, we've said, stop killing us. Please stop killing us. You better stop killing us. And now I feel like we're shaking. I feel like with the looting and the violence, the violent demonstrations are shaking. Somebody say, I said, stop doing this to me. And so I get that. I'm not excusing it. I don't know if it's the best way to do it. I don't even feel like I get a vote in whether or not it's the best way to do it.
Darren. That is legitimate. And I have heard that too, and it is. That anger is legitimate. Like, you've told us for decades, don't do it that way. Don't do it that way. Do it nicely. Say it nicely.
Yeah.
We try. So the anger is absolutely legitimate.
Which furthers the point what I'm saying earlier is like, hey, say it nicely, say it nicely. Say it nicely to who? Up the chain, you know what I mean? Like, that's all I'm saying. I agree with you that, believe me, looting is not I'm just not that way. I wouldn't, but I just have to have some, when I think of it most recently happened in Ferguson, right? It was more contained just to St. Louis, right? It didn't spread. Now this time it's, so that everywhere. Squeeze mechanism of like shaking Darren is exactly right. But I guess my question, not my question to anybody, but just always my question is, it's like, yeah, you hear it all the time when you're outnumbered. Hey, we're supposed to act this way, and we're supposed to, you're not supposed to be loud like that. Okay. And and if this is something that just ain't happening the first time, this is 100. I mean, like, we're on decades of this. Well, then what else are we supposed to do? Yeah. Right. Yeah. And then who else are you supposed to say it to when it doesn't look the same?
Yeah. Tania, I feel like you've been waiting to jump in on something.
Well, yeah, I'm like, ooh, that's a great point. That's a great point too. I feel like we talked a lot about like how it kind of got here and how the feelings progressed so much. And I feel like when I look at it, I get frustrated at the fact that like racism has become so normal that it's a joke to a certain extent. Like when I watch TV, there's so much like comedic lines about like, oh, well, what do you expect? They're Black. Or like, oh, of course she's going to say something because that's what we think of Black people. And so it's this normal level of baseline that I think when we say it wasn't that bad, it stems from like that fact that it's normal in society. And when people look at it of the line of like what's normal, like, okay, so you got called the N-word. That's not that bad, right? Because you could have been shot. So someone like pushed you and was angry with you. It's not that bad because like somebody could have screamed at you in front of your children and humiliated you. So that like that level is there. And I think constantly in our minds, when you are the only minority or the only Black person in a room, and when you do go to the authority, like Zorn said, it's dismissed because people are constantly communicating it's not that bad. So I think we internalize it and we keep it because what we're comparing it to is much worse. And I think a part of it, maybe the next step is removing the shame from having conversations of I'm offended. Instead of like me going to a person and saying, hey, it makes me really uncomfortable that you constantly make comments about my hair, right? And then that turns into like, well, don't change your hair if you don't want me to comment on it, which is, that just shut the door. And then if I go to somebody else and I'm like, can you believe that they said that? And they're like, well, at least they didn't call you like, you know, it could have been worse. So it's, I think taking out that like defense mechanism when it comes to having to justify, because nobody wants to be called a racist, but there are actions out there that are so blatantly biased that it's hard to move past that. And it's like, I can't tell you how I feel about something and we can't have a great dialogue if you're not willing to accept that there's a clear bias in this conversation. And then telling me to pacify myself by saying it's not that bad. It's kind of a comfort for, I would say for myself, like that's become a comfort and part of my life of being like, okay, I could focus on this and focus on the fact that no one helped me and no one stood up for me, or I can walk away saying it's not that bad, move forward, move on with my life. And then it builds up to this anger of where I get to a certain point and I'm seeing people that look like me dying. I'm picturing myself in that situation. I'm picturing my friends in that situation. And I'm going, okay, it seems like everybody's saying it's not that bad again. And it brings up that like that emotion and that feeling of like, no, it's awful. It's terrible. And we had steps not to get here, but somebody didn't want to be offended. And so they never opened up the conversation to go deeper. They never opened up like that pathway to talk about like, why am I offended by this? Why are you offended by what I just said to you? I didn't mean that in any which way. And so I think that like, if we could take it a couple steps back, or if we could move forward and kind of before we go to something that you think or that someone thinks is so mundane that a person of color or a person that's different from you comes and says, hey, why'd you say that? Or why did you make that comment? Or that sounds really weird. Even if it's like another white person who's like, I don't really think that sounded right. Instead of being like, oh no, that's fine. I'm okay with it. They know, or I don't need to explain myself, or I don't need to have that conversation. I think taking shame out of the offense of being biased, we all have biases. That's a natural part of being a human. It's the way, it's what we've been exposed to. It's what we're around. It's the way we're raised. It's like the voices of our parents, the voices of our friends, they build our perception of the world. And we do have to counteract a lot of that most of our life of like, oh, that doesn't match up to what I heard as a child is not a reality as an adult. And being open to say that sometimes my world can shatter a little bit so that it can get bigger opens up a conversation of like, okay, how do I contribute to this less? How do I make it comfortable for people to be frustrated without enraging people to a point of just such like tearful anger? And that starts with taking out shame.
How do you do that?
Yeah.
I agree with you. Like, I mean, I think one of my questions for you guys is how many of you have had friends who've had white friends who have ever said, share with me your experience or tell me how to have this conversation with you, or Tania and Zorn, I remember us having a very distinct conversation in my office when I think was probably the first real intentional help. I want to understand better. And I don't want to unintentionally say something biased or racist or what I don't want to accidentally say something that offends you and not even know I'm doing it. So like as you're talking about that, I'm just like I agree that that's the key, and also the up the chain part. But I don't know how we do that. And I will tell you, like, there have been multiple times, especially since moving to Chicago, because while we are a very diverse city, we're still a very segregated city.
Mm.
And there's a lot of racism in Chicago, regardless of how many people of color of all nationalities that live here. And I've heard multiple conversations where I was like, ooh, that makes me feel itchy. Like they didn't just come out and use the N-word or, say something just blatantly off the chain, because clearly I feel like I would immediately call that out and have. But that felt a little racist, or I don't think we handled that the way we should have, and I feel shame just about those moments of not saying right then, why would you say that? What difference does it make that he was black, or whatever? And so how do we do that? How do we as white people have a conversation that is not off-putting or awkward or weird? How do we approach people of color and say, help me understand that better? And how do you help us remove shame from that conversation when I do say something that, when I do over compliment your hair and you have to say, I really wish you wouldn't do that, how do I walk away from that conversation and go, oh, I understand her better, and not, oh, I screwed that up? Does that make sense?
Yeah. In my experience, I love when someone comes up to me and says, hey, I really don't know how to handle this. Or like, I had a conversation with a colleague a while ago who said, hey, this is really confusing for me. Some people like to be called Black. Some people like to be called African Americans. How do I navigate that? I don't want to offend someone. And first it took me off guard, like similar to how Danette said, like somebody coming up to you and you're the only one that's been in that situation and you're processing through all these filters. That's like, am I the only Black person that you know to ask this question to? This feels like I'm on the spot right now. I don't understand why you would come. We've never spoken. But then landing on being like, actually, that's not a bad question. And if you were to ask anybody, I'm glad that you're asking me. I'm glad that you came up to ask the question rather than make the assumption. And we ended the conversation with being like, honestly, the whole point of that question, which is great, is that you have to see that Black people are all different. And so a conversation with me is not going to get you the answer, but you asking the question opens this door for you. When you speak to someone that's Black, ask them, how do you like to be addressed? Are you African American? Are you Black? Like if I say I like to be, I don't think about it. Either one, it doesn't matter. It still means my skin tone and how you describe me. But someone has a very distinct way that they like to be described. But the whole essence of that is be uncomfortable. Like you talked about, like, I don't want to start an awkward conversation. I don't want it to get weird. It's going to get weird, and let it get weird, because like what you're processing, the person that you're speaking to is also processing of whether like, should I be offended, or do I help this person, or like, is this going to end in a good way? And I think that's the part of like, now I've had a lot of friends who've reached out to me and they've been like, hey, how can we talk about this? Like you said, Darren, like, how can we talk about this? How can we address this? What can we do better? And I'm like, 3 years ago, like even 2 years ago, no one has ever reached out to me to ask me, like, how can I see you better? How can I help you better? Or like, can we have a conversation about race? Because I've never had that conversation before. And just being open to it being awkward, I think is the key of like, let it get weird. It's going to. It's fine.
I mean, I'm down for weird. So yeah. I think I probably got that cornered, actually. So
I actually had a funny conversation. It was we had a foster son that came in, and he happened to be Black, and his name was Omere with an apostrophe over the E. So we're like, shoot, we don't know how to pronounce his name. So we had to pull one of my Black friends aside. Hey, is it Omari, or is it Omir, or is it? But it's just one of those things where you have to be uncomfortable. Like, But I think, the starting place is, man, race can be fun. Culture is fun. I think a lot of people want to say, okay, it's too PC to talk about race. I love talking to people who are even, especially from immigrant families, because sometimes you're like, hey, is this an immigrant thing or is this a cultural thing? Like, what is it? Like, it's just funny. For example, I have family members that wrap their remote controls in saran wrap, so, and that's something that's not just in my family, but it's prevalent in a lot of Chinese families. That's just funny nuances.
I want to know about that. Why is that?
I think it has something to do with just the I don't want to say poverty mentality, but because they want to savor something that they worked hard for.
Okay.
So things like that, yeah. That it is. It's funny when you figure out, hey, you can talk about race and some of the nuances. It can be funny, and it doesn't have to be all political all the time or PC all the time. It's fun. Rush Hour, for example, where it's a buddy cop film, learning about culture. That's funny.
I think like Ken said, it can be fun, but at the end of the day, the only way that we're going to be able to do this is having our school and our kids learn about it, and not because 90% no, most people are scared of an awkward conversation, and that's just the way that they're wired. Most people are scared to be the first to talk about it, and they need that reassurance, and some people like weird, and I'm with Tania. I'm glad that some people want to ask questions, but at the end of the day, it's an unknowing or unknowledged. If we would dig in more into our schools and have these conversations of different heritage, and different backgrounds, it opens the door to have those conversations, because school is the first place where you come together and you learn, and when you go to that classroom, now you want to ask, hey, why is Tania's hair braided like this? Or why did she change? Oh, okay. I learned this in school and class. And that to me goes back to the same thing of the police officers: unknowledge, not knowing, not fully educated in the laws and the Protect and Serve Act and the de-escalating, scenarios and how to do that well. It always has to end up going all the way to a white shirt sergeant who knows the full rules and knows, that takes too long. So I'm with all you guys. I love the funness of it, and I love the questions, but I do think that we just got to start putting this in schools more and in colleges more, and the conversations will come up naturally, and they'll just happen.
Yeah, I was doing some research and stuff, and that's why, man, just seeing, I feel like in American history, especially, that racism is in there, especially against Black people. Even looking back to the disparity of, I was just looking at this, I think it was for the net income for families. The average net income for a Black family is about $17,000, and the net income for a white family is $171,000. So then I was doing some more research, and they were talking about it was because of, obviously slavery and not allowing people to own property and stuff. I mean, it even goes back to just recently, a decade ago, 15 years ago, where banks weren't giving loans to the same rate as to minorities, more specifically Blacks. And then they talked about even 40 years ago where they said, hey, they didn't want Blacks in neighborhoods. And there were different ways, even though it was illegal, but different ways to convince Blacks not to come into neighborhoods because it will lower their property value. So that's ingrained in the culture. And that's why when we talk about, what's interesting is, since a lot of us are minorities, like we kind of understand that, because we've been exploring what it looks like to have privilege or no privilege. And to everyone else, if you will, it's like, it's a shock for them. Wait, this has happened. Yeah, it's been happening. And the reason why it's a shock and no one wants to talk about it, if you will, our white friends, is because people have started just processing that now without knowing that, oh, this has been there in all of history.
All along. Yeah.
All along. Yeah.
Yeah.